My beloved clients and friends. I want to do a follow-up video to our last one about Trump's economic policy. And I got some questions from clients asking, I've heard that Trump's economic policy is inflationary, and the market's kind of concerned about that. So I wanted to address that question from an economic perspective and look at Trump's economic policy and where it stands on that spectrum of economic policies. So I titled this Reaganomics versus Bidenomics. And as you know, I prefer to do these on a more casual basis while I'm going for my morning walk. But I wanted to display some things graphically. And so I decided to do a more formal presentation on this. So with that, let's just jump right into it. So I want to look at supply side versus demand side economics. And it's kind of two approaches that government takes to, to try to manage the economy and get long-term growth out of the economy. And it's two different styles. And Trump's style would be on the supply side. Okay. And so that supply side economics was popularized by Ronald Reagan in the 80s, and they're looking on the side of suppliers or businesses to help promote economic growth by allowing businesses to flourish, as opposed to the demand side, which would be consumers, right? So it tends to be a pro-business, free market type of policy, right? And here's some of the common approaches that would be part of a supply side economic strategy. Well, one is to lower corporate taxes, because what they're trying to do is make it easier for business, or lower the costs to business. And one of the costs to businesses is obviously corporate taxes. So if they could lower the cost, then those businesses could be more competitive. They could pass on those savings in part to their customers, right? And it tends to be deflationary. Another thing that would be a supply side type of economic policy would be less government regulation or less bureaucratic red tape. And that's one of the elements of Trump's economic policy. He's talking about lowering corporate taxes again, which he did in 2017, making that permanent and maybe even taking it lower. Less government regulation. Reagan was famous for saying that government isn't the solution, government's the problem. And so Trump got Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to be in charge of the Department of Government Efficiency, which they affectionately call DOGE, to not only eliminate a lot of government red tape, but also control government spending and maybe limit the amount and the size of government programs. So yeah, less government regulation would also be lowering the cost of doing businesses, because going through all that red tape, there's a cost to businesses, and if that cost could be lower, if it could be more efficient, easier, well, then they could pass those cost savings on, in theory, to their consumers. And then fewer environmental restrictions. Those environmental restrictions are also a cost of doing business. And one of Trump's policies is drill, baby, drill. And increasing the oil supply would be a cost savings. We'd see gas prices go down, and gas and energy is a huge cost to businesses, especially transportation costs, but energy costs in general. So all those three would lower the cost to businesses and make businesses more competitive. And the theory is that those benefits well, they will accrue to businesses, but they'll trickle down through the economy. Like, for example, when recently in my business, we switched from Pershing to Altruist as our clearing firm. And that came with some cost savings to my business. And what did we do? Well, in turn, we lowered the costs, the fees to our clients. Um, but So I passed on part of that savings to my clients, and I passed on part of the savings to my businesses. So it was, you could say it's a win-win. But that's kind of the essence of supply side economics, which is the type of uh, policies that Trump is following. Now, detractors would say, well, it disproportionately benefits the rich, and some people will get left behind. And that's sometimes what people say, well, supply side economics doesn't work because it really is just a trickle that goes down. Um, but it does benefit the economy as a whole. And so uh, we're just presenting it. We're not necessarily supporting it or refuting it. We're just giving you both sides of what supply side economics looks like. And so the other side would be demand side economics, which we could call Bidenomics, right? And the goal of that would be to correct some of the inequities of the free market. Because supply side economics is kind of like let the government get the government out of the way of businesses and let businesses just prosper, and um, a rising tide will lift all boats is a theory. But um, some people say, well, some people get left out, so it's the job of the government not only to support businesses but to redistribute the wealth to the areas that the free market leaves behind. That would be demand side economics. So they would say, well, the market would not give enough people education. It's too expensive for some people, and the market left of itself would not give everybody health care. So what do we do with those people that get left behind? And the market would price some people out of housing, and some people can't afford to feed themselves and stuff like that in a pure free market economy. So the government needs to subsidize education and healthcare and housing and welfare to those that get left behind. And that tends to come with a cost, of course. And so government has to raise taxes, and as opposed to saying, well, no regulations and just let business run free without restrictions. They're like, no, they do need regulations, and we do need environmental restrictions. Well, all those things are a cost, right? So demand side economics in general tends to be inflationary. Okay, that's, I mean, from an economic standpoint, we're just stating the facts, not giving our opinion on if we favor supply side or demand side. We're just looking at the pros and cons of both. Okay, so detractors would say, how are you going to pay for this great society? Because really, Lyndon Johnson was one of the champions of this demand side economics in the late 60s. He had these policies called the Great Society, and no one will be hungry, and no one will be unhoused, and everyone will have education, right? And that led to a lot of inflation in the 70s, to the point where people got tired of it and they were looking for another, let's try something else. And Reagan ended up getting elected in the 80s, and him and as along with the Fed chair, Paul Volcker, the first thing they did was get inflation out of the economy, because all this demand side economics had created a lot of inflation, and They fixed that, and then they went to work on supply side economics, and we saw 3 decades of really strong economic growth with very little inflation. Because not only Reagan, in his 8 years, he promoted these supply side policies, but um, Bush did as well, and even Clinton. He was kind of a very fiscally conservative uh, president, and the same kind of policies. He was the champion in NAFTA, which was, you know, um, that type of free market policy. So if that's just to give you a summary of what supply side economics looks like, which Trump would be for the most part a champion of, versus demand side economics, which we saw under Biden. And if we look at that graphically, it really pops out what the effect of that is. So supply side policies tend to be deflationary. This first black line here is supply, and the goal of the supply side policies would be to push that supply curve out, right? By doing that, what you end up is a higher output, as seen on the horizontal axis, and lower prices. Simultaneously, higher output with lower prices. So that's what happens graphically. It just makes sense. I mean, think about empirically, it makes sense. Well, lower cost to businesses is going to be lower costs for that output. And you see it graphically, it really just makes a ton of sense. Of course, if you push the supply curve out, you're going to get more output at lower prices. Whereas demand side policies tend to be inflationary. If we push out the demand curve, right, we are going to get higher output, but it's going to be at higher prices. And that's what we saw. And it just makes sense. When the three areas of the most inflation in the economy have been the areas that the government has been the most involved in, which is education, healthcare, and housing, right? They're in an effort to get people educations that normally couldn't afford it. They provide subsidies and Pell Grants and Pell Grants and loans and different subsidies. And inevitably, when the government gives these students more money to pay for college, well, the colleges are going to raise their prices. Same thing with healthcare. When the government gives people more money to afford healthcare, the healthcare companies are going to raise their prices. And like one of Harris's planks in her policy was, well, every first-time buyer, we're going to give them $25,000 to buy a house. Well, obviously that's probably going to be inflationary, especially for housing prices. And people would complain, well, how can I compete with that person that gets a check from the government and I don't get one? Or, why do I have to pay for my education and they don't? And so both of the policies tend to have some kind of division, because there's winners and losers. You say, well, how come on supply side economics, other people say, well, why do the benefits go to the rich? And on the demand side, they say, why do the benefits only go to these people? And so there's an in-group and an out-group, and there's some pushback on both policies. But fundamentally, supply side economics is generally deflationary. Fundamentally, demand side policies tend to be inflationary. So to answer the question, are Trump's policies inflationary? In general, no. In general, his policies are deflationary. Now, there's one aspect of his policy that can be inflationary, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But aside from what the government's doing, the Fed, starting with Paul Volcker and continuing with Greenspan, Bernanke, and then Yellen, and now Powell, inflation was their overwhelming priority, and to get it down to 2%, starting with Volcker. And um, it was funny because in 1991 I started in the business, and we were doing retirement planning, and we would factor in 3% inflation into our retirement plans. And I questioned that. I said, why are we factoring in 3% when inflation is really only 2? And this was in early 90s, and the answer was, well, historically it's been higher than that. That's if you at the time, that was inflation had only been at 2 for through maybe half of the 80s, and prior to that, 70s and 60s, and inflation was higher because of these um, demand side policies by the government. But sure enough, from the time I started in the business, for the next 30 years, inflation was consistently right around 2%. And so I asked myself, why did my industry model 3% when inflation was really only 2? And I mean, to be honest, it makes the number bigger, and it makes the presentation tell you to invest more. And so it was kind of a sales tactic. I didn't like it. I was more transparent with my clients, and we used 2% inflation to model out our retirement plans because it seemed more honest to me. But anyways, yeah, these guys have for 30 plus years prior to COVID, and even with the economic crisis of 2008, they kept inflation around 2% for decades. Now, there were other deflationary mega trends going on at the time. One was technology. Technology tends to be deflationary. And the perfect example, I think, is TVs. And I mean, we've seen TVs over the last 30 years get bigger and better and cheaper. I mean, by the month. A lot of people have thinking about buying a TV and say, well, I'll just wait a couple months because in a couple months they'll be bigger, they'll be cheaper, and they'll be from HD to ultra HD and ultra high HD, and we've seen these things getting better and better and better and bigger and bigger and bigger. When I was a kid, we used to watch a 19-inch TV, and they kept getting bigger, 24-inch and 30-inch and 36-inch TV. You thought you were cool because you had a 42-inch TV, and then they came 50-inch and 60 and 70, and they kept getting cheaper and cheaper. And that's what technology does. It's deflationary. It brings the price of stuff down. Globalization has also been a mega trend that has been happening for the last several decades, that if we allow businesses to source labor and capital from around the world, there's an opportunity to get it cheaper in other places of the world. Different things are cheaper in different places, and if we open that up, then they're able to produce goods and services at a cheaper price, and that is deflationary. The aging population, which we have experienced in the industrialized world, as people getting older and having less kids, the population is getting older. And I mean, in your own experience, many of you could relate that, as you get older, you spend a little bit less. If you go to grandma's house, you might see the same couch and fridge and furniture that you've seen your whole life, right? She's wearing the same dress that you've seen your whole life, and people tend to buy less and less. I know when I turned 35, I felt that the commercials didn't necessarily pertain to me anymore, and because that I was out of that, everybody's favorite demographic, that young demographic that spends a lot of money and buys a lot of stuff, and as you get older you buy less. So an aging population tends to demand a little bit less, save more and spend less, and that's somewhat deflationary as well. So those mega trends have helped the government and the Fed keep inflation down. Okay, Now, there are some inflationary trends. Governments, especially the ones that employ these demand side policies, they incur a lot of debt. And as that debt burden gets bigger, that's inflationary, because the governments have to, or borrowers have to compete with the government for capital, and it just raises the demand for capital and it raises prices. Um, Fiat currencies that are not tied to anything, governments tend to print more money than they have to, or to pay for these things. They either go into debt or print money, and those things are both inflationary. Now, recently, globalization has gone the other way, towards deglobalization, especially since COVID, and people were less dependent, less confident or trusting of each other. And not only in America has been this push for America first type of policies, but around the world, other countries have been, home team first. And so there's been a recent trend of deglobalization, as opposed to the longer term trend of globalization. So, and this is one of the areas where Trump's policy is not as free market as the rest of his policies. And some will say, well, this piece of his policy, that deglobalization, is indeed inflationary. And there's a lot to unpack there, so we're going to save that for the next video. But suffice it to say that the conclusion that I want to make in this video is supply side policies, which for the most part Trump's policies are, with the exception of deglobalization, tend to be deflationary. So now we'll say, are the rest of the policies more deflationary than the deglobalization policies are inflationary? And we'll address that in the next video, but I didn't want to go too much longer. So the next one, we're going to talk about Trump's anti-free market policies, in particular tariffs and deportations, and can these policies be inflationary? And even if they are, we want, like I said in the previous video, to look at it in total. A good part of his policies are deflationary. A small part of his policies can be inflationary, and you got to look at it together. So this is my first swing at answering that question about are Trump's policies inflationary. In the next video, we'll look specifically at deglobalization to wrap up my answer to that question. So I hope you guys have a great